Recently I had a few projects come up that required time-lapse photography over a number of days to film some art installations. So I finally built something that I've really wanted to build for a long time, which is a remotely accessible time-lapse rig. So this here is my time-lapse rig. It's built into a knockoff Pelican case that I got from my local auto parts supplier, and I've put a Raspberry Pi computer in there. If you don't know what a Raspberry Pi is, it's essentially just a really small computer and you can use it for different programming tasks. And in the case of this, it's kind of like the brain behind this whole thing, and it's what triggers the camera, and it's also what allows me to access it remotely through a 4G dongle or through Wi-Fi. So at the front of the case, I've cut out a hole, which is where the lens pokes through so that it can see what it needs to see. And then the camera sits in the case here, and it's mounted on a quick release plate so that it can be taken out and settings can be adjusted and it can go back in there. And the camera that's in here is just my old Canon 60D, which is actually the camera that I launched my career on back in 2013. So it's a little bit of an older camera. Because it's doing time-lapse photography, we can get away with that lower megapixel count. At the top here, we have a USB power hub, which I'm using to power everything. So I've got a dummy battery in the camera, which is powered by the USB cable, and the Raspberry Pi is also powered from there. The Raspberry Pi then has its own USB ports that power up the 4G dongle, and there's another USB cable that runs to the camera to control it. There's a tripod plate mounted to the bottom of it so it can just easily attach to a tripod, which is how I've used it the times that I've used it so far, just tucked away in the corner filming a art installation and some traffic cones around the bottom of the tripod so that people don't run into it. And that's why I've got some stickers on the outside just explaining that time-lapse photography is in process, don't touch. And this is enough in that environment where there's already enough security. There's some artworks that are worth a lot more than this is, and security and all of that, so there's no worries. But for a longer term installation outside, unattended, you'd probably need to look at some other measures, locking it up, obviously weather sealing it, and anything else that you need to do to make sure it's safe. So the biggest challenge in creating this rig was actually programming the Raspberry Pi to operate the camera and do everything I needed to do with that. So that was a bit of a learning curve for me because I've never worked with a Raspberry Pi before and I've got no programming experience, but I've been able to create something that works for what I need it to and has all the functionality that I need at this stage. So the Raspberry Pi surprised me actually in that you just boot it up and it looks like a operating system like Windows or Mac. It's based on Linux. And you can just use it like a computer. It's quite incredible what you can do on this tiny little chip. You have an internet browser, you can do all sorts of things. It's a bit slow because it's so tiny, but for the purposes of this, it's great. Something that took me a little while to figure out was how to actually get the Raspberry Pi to trigger the camera for time-lapse and copy the files off it. And the way that this is all possible is through a library called Gphoto 2, which has been created to control different cameras through the Raspberry Pi via its USB port, and a YouTube video by Alexander Baran-Harper, which actually steps through exactly how to install that onto the Raspberry Pi and create a Python script which you run in order to take photos using the camera, copy the photos off, and repeat the process, essentially creating a time-lapse. I'm going to include a link in the description and above to that video, and that steps through everything that I know about Python. I don't know anything else outside of that. I've taken the script in the video and followed it through, and then I've made some slight tweaks to it just to make it a bit cleaner and more understandable for me. So I'll also include my copy in the description so that you can have a look at it if you're looking to pursue this project. But of course, if you're using different cameras, you will need to dig into other YouTube videos or do some research into Gphoto 2 in order to get the right commands. So once the script was created, it's as simple as just jumping into a command line on the Raspberry Pi, navigating to where that script exists, and typing a command in order to start the process. Now, in the script itself, there's a section to change the folder name that it will save to, as well as the file names. So we change all these parameters, and then that allows us to start the process of creating a folder on the Raspberry Pi, turning on the camera, and then we tell it to take a photo, and then we copy that photo from the camera to the Raspberry Pi, rename it on the Raspberry Pi and put it in the right spot, delete the file off the SD card on the camera so it doesn't fill up, and then we have a delay of a certain amount of seconds, and then the process repeats. And so we can change the time that it takes between the process repeating to change the interval of the time lapse. Once a photo's been taken and it's saved in the directory on the Raspberry Pi, we can remote desktop into the Raspberry Pi and copy those files to ourselves using Google Drive or through our remote desktop app, and then we can view the photos on our local computer. We can also view photos directly from the Raspberry Pi just for a quick check, but obviously you won't be getting the full quality when you're viewing them over a remote desktop connection. For the projects that I had on, I set up the camera on the first day and made sure that the framing was right and the exposure was right, and then logged into my computer and started the time lapse, took a few photos, just made sure it was all working, checked that they were in focus and all of that. And then I left and I drove home, and over the course of the next 3 days that the time lapse was running, I just checked periodically through the day to make sure it was still taking photos and it was working perfectly. And then at the end, I came back, took the camera down, and I had all the photos I needed to compile together and create a time lapse. So I did run into a couple of problems while building this rig. The first of those is that remote desktop applications can be quite expensive when using them commercially, so you've got to look around and find one that will work for you. Another problem I had was actually copying the whole bulk of the photos at the end of the time lapse was actually a little bit more difficult than it needed to be. I think it was a limitation with using a Mac and not being able to copy the photos directly onto a USB off the Raspberry Pi and onto the computer. So I had to find a workaround to that, but that may have just been a firmware and software issue. And the biggest disappointment of this rig really was the camera. It's definitely showing its age, and even though it's adequate, a newer camera with more megapixels, more dynamic range, a nicer image, and a nicer lens would definitely make the time-lapse look a lot nicer. In the future, if I get around to creating a version 2 of this, there's definitely a few things that I'll look at changing or doing differently. The first is that I'll probably put it in a slightly bigger case, not too much bigger, but that'll just allow a little bit more room to move around and also hopefully alleviate any problems with heat, because I've definitely been concerned with this to make sure that it doesn't get too hot in there, because we do have power and we've got the Raspberry Pi running. So that's one consideration, and something that I definitely want to look into more just to make sure that I'm not creating a fire hazard. And especially if I do one of the other things, which is to create a weather sealing to it. So putting glass on the front of it and making sure that all the screws and all of that don't bring water in so it can be used outside. That will definitely create some issues with ventilation and heat control. So that's something that I'm going to look at when I need to. I also want to be able to power it through a battery of some description, whether the battery is inside the unit or connected through a power cable. I just want some way of being able to power it without needing a main socket available so that I can take time lapses in locations that don't necessarily have mains power. Another thing that I'd consider in a newer version of this is adding some extra camera control. At the moment, my software is very simple and it just triggers the camera to take a photo, but you do need to be able to touch the camera in order to change any settings. But using Gphoto, you can change some of those settings. So to develop some way of controlling the camera aperture and shutter speed would be very useful. And I'd also like to improve how I copy photos off it, just to make it a little bit simpler and add a simpler functionality to directly upload to the cloud. Every time a photo's taken, it's accessible remotely. If I was to get really fancy and go a little bit out of control, I'd consider whether we could add some motors to the bottom of it and make it into a motion control rig, but that's probably getting way, way above what I'm capable of programming. This was a really fun little device to make. I really enjoyed the challenge of pulling it all together, of creating the physical unit and programming the Raspberry Pi in order to take the photos. It took me a few days to actually get everything done, especially the Raspberry Pi and the programming took lots of time for me to figure out. But if you've got any kind of programming experience, you're probably leaps and bounds ahead of me. So you'll be able to do it far, far quicker than I can. But it was a great way to actually learn some of this stuff, and I feel like I've now got a good basis to do other things with it. All up, I estimate that this cost me around 350 Australian dollars to build, which definitely isn't cheap, but for the functionality, it's great, because actual commercial time-lapse rigs go for thousands of dollars. So I think that's actually quite a bargain. especially considering that all the components, I can see other ways that I could use them if I was to deconstruct this rig. I'm sure there's ways that you could create a cheaper version of this rig, especially if you didn't add the 4G functionality and just stuck to the Wi-Fi built into the Raspberry Pi. And if you had a case laying around, different things like that, you could save some money if you wanted to. I think that this time-lapse rig is a great asset, something that's really good to have available, especially if certain projects come up that require weeks-long time lapses. It's something that I have available now, and especially if I rebuilt it with weatherproofing and potentially a battery option, it could open up doing some long-term construction time lapses or something in that vein, which would be a great way to earn some money without having to actually do all that much work day to day. Well, that's a quick look at my time-lapse camera rig. I hope that you got something out of it and you might be inspired to try your own DIY project like this. It was really fun, I really enjoyed it, so I definitely recommend it if you've got any use for something like this. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments down below, and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one. Have I really introduced you to Suzanne yet? That's Suzanne. Helps me out when I'm trying to get focus and framing. Bit weird, but does the job.